out on the stream. It's being streamed to the internet, and also it's being recorded to put up on YouTube. And we're privileged and honored to be able to welcome to the program a humanitarian of great lifelong concern with civil rights, anti-war, and general improvement of the human condition in an outstanding way at all levels of government and society. A major voice for peace in the world, and it's none other than the Honorable Ramsey Clark. And Ramsey Clark, we thank you so much for coming here and talking to us producers. And so without further ado, let's give a round welcome to Ramsey Clark. And one, I would say the bell may be ringing, so don't let that interfere with your consciousness that people are coming. There might be other people coming. So let's give a warm welcome to Ramsey Clark. And thanks a lot for coming.
Thank you. Well, you're exposing yourself to high risk. I'm from Texas, and you ask a Texan to talk, and they don't stop. So watch out, get comfortable, sleep if you can, in face of all the noise. The subject won't be happy, but it'll be where we are and what we need to do. We've let our country come into a state of perpetual war. The amount of money that we spend on arms assures war. What are you going to do with all those guns and bombs, and how are you going to justify more of them if you don't use them? And they get more dangerous all the time. Our capacity for omnicide through the military is now pretty clear. We have the ability to destroy life on Earth through our military. The best example is the Trident II nuclear fleets. I've worked with the Plowshares people. I'm sure you've heard of them. They're beautiful, basically Catholic radical, but not all Catholic, pacifists. But they don't mind more than personal inconvenience. They don't mind nearly freezing to death to crawl under electrified wires and radar screens and everything else to get up to the bomb depot for the Pacific Trident II nuclear fleet. There are 30 submarines in the Trident II nuclear submarine fleet. 8 are at sea on alert at all times in this one fleet of 4 Trident II nuclear fleets in the world. They're huge, monstrous, fat submarines because they've got about 110. They vary slightly, but say roughly 110 missiles and warheads. 110 per ship. And the warheads are of 2 calibers. One's about 12 times the destructive blast force of the Hiroshima bomb, 12 times. It killed 500,000 people. And the larger one, they say, will leave a crater 50 miles in diameter. That's the actual crater. Not terribly deep, but a shallow bowl. Just try to think of where we live geographically here and put that in the place that'll catch the most people, the biggest population. You can take out Manhattan and all the 5 boroughs here, and you can take out Newark, and you can take out a county or 2 out onto Long Island, and you can take up into Connecticut. You can probably kill 25 million people with one bomb. Just suppose you were going to attack Europe. You decide Europe's got to go. Imagine launching 120 of those warheads toward Europe. There's probably not a person in the room that could name 120 cities in Europe. You'd have to think a long time to do it, you know. Just think of one of those ships. with a sane mind, with a rational mind, ever conceive, I mean, if you were Jules Verne or something, you know, writing 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, you got a big imagination, so you, but would a sane person dream of such a thing as being something we would want to put into actuality? How are you going to use it? Who's Captain Nemo going to be? And you got 8 submerged in the Pacific at all times. Just think of launching them against China, or big country, huge population. But what's the fallout beyond the actual destruction, the total obliteration? And here you've got 4 of those fleets. And we have permitted our country to build such a massive, worldwide deployed system for mass destruction. It almost makes Hiroshima look like a tinker toy. And still more militarism. We've been at war, constant war, for the lives of the majority of our people. If you go back to the beginning of Iraq, you can go back a little further and still have continuous war, but heavy war began in Iraq in January of '91. And you read the paper this morning or any morning, and you find people still being killed there, utter chaos there, no security there. Still 6 million people internally displaced from their homes, and 4 million, and we're talking about a fourth to a third of the population, internally displaced, and 2 or 3 million still in Syria. Syria was had a closed border with Iraq all the years from 1991, when the Gulf War began, until the war against Syria began. But when, in spite of the closed frontier, they took in 1.5 million to 2 million Iraqis who had fled because they couldn't survive in their own homeland, or didn't think they could. And they gave them free schooling, and they gave them food when they needed it. They gave them free medicine. At one time, I drove to 10 ICRC bases, Red Cross and Red Crescent bases in near the Iraqi-Syria border. And the majority of all the people that were coming in there daily, they'd average 300 to 700 patients coming in a day. A majority, and all of them, were Iraqis, and no charge. And the people would open their homes. People in Aleppo, clear across the country, would open their homes. By that I mean they would move into 2 rooms and leave 1 room for Iraqis to come into. That was human nature at that time, and here we're trying to destroy them both. We've already destroyed the cradle of civilization. What it will do, it's amazing how durable people are, but you just wonder how long people can take that sort of destruction and have any sense of compassion or love or desire to help others when it's all you can do to save yourself and your own. And still we go on and invent new things, drones and things like that. Drones are, by definition, they're indiscriminate and arbitrary murder. We used to think that you're entitled to a fair trial, but now your fair trial is the CIA, because the CIA determines And what's the president know? He says, well, I'm going to make the decision. But you have to make a decision that has any rationality on the basis of facts. What's he know? I mean, he's a very smart man, but he doesn't know who's driving where in Sudan or in Yemen or in Syria or wherever it is. He knows what the CIA tells him. And what do they know? They make more mistakes than the average kid that flunks out of junior high school, you know? I mean, literally, if you want to put it to account, the lessons they have to learn are considerably more complicated. You can't read out of a book, get out there in the bush and scrub it out. But and who else is in the car? Or you see a shadowy figure going into a house, you say, I think that was him, and you hit the house and there's 7 people in there, and you kill them all and you don't give a damn. And you keep doing it. And what psychology does it create among the people? Right this moment there, a drone may hit us. What kind of living is that? And where does it come from? Trying those cases is amazing because you find that they're fired from air bases in the United States. And if they use real pilots, the excuse for using the pilots is that they'll have a better sense of timing. So you watch him, and the pilot's sitting there, and he's got TV screens, but he's sitting near an air base just north of Las Vegas. That was our first trial. Or near the capital of Kansas, which the air base is about 100 miles west of there. Or Syracuse, New York. We've had 3 trials up there. There's an air base right there. And they're sitting there, and they're firing these drones, which are buzzing around thousands and thousands of miles away. And they see the car going down the road, the guy going into the house, and they decide that they got body language and all, and they look at him and they say, okay, now pow, and they punch the button, and boom. And there's no place on earth that's safe from that. So in a country that you're hassling, the leadership has to depend on acting in a way that he won't be drone bait. Because he knows that the U.S. can take him out like that if it decides to. Or if they're in for bigger meat, they just take out the whole city. And it's our responsibility, we the people. And we have miserably, miserably failed. That's one reason what I call grassroots TV. You're not going to get this information on the networks. The networks are owned, run, and programs are determined by the values of the 1%. I mean, isn't that pretty obvious? If you're going to give the people a chance to see what they ought to see and hear what they ought to hear and learn how they can organize and act. You know, we talk about power to the people in the old days, but in a sense that's an oxymoron, in the sense that the power is obviously in the people. I mean, if the people act, what can anybody do against them? If we, the people, act, what can they do? Because they're outnumbered, you know, there's just a handful of them in comparison. But we have all these distractions, you know, and we have to put food on the table. We're about to have a kid or whatever it is. And we don't organize. And they're good at disorganizing us. And they're good at breaking up organizations. But getting the message is the only way you can hope for the people to overcome. If we shall overcome, we have to have the message that there's a problem, that this is the problem, that we agree with what the problem is, and that we're going to eliminate the problem. And again, it's redundant to say power's in the people. It's a truism. But the people have to act as a people in unity to ensure that our government does things and only things that are good for children, where they can live happy and grow healthy and be kind and true. And that's possible. We used to sing songs in Sunday school when I was a little kid. Sunday school's over and we're going home. Goodbye, goodbye. Be always kind and true. And the people who are kind and true are going to have, except for all them others that aren't, they're going to have good lives. And for each one of them, a couple of other people have better lives than they'd otherwise ever have. What we're doing is also, this is a beautiful planet. I'm old enough to, I went all through the Amazon Valley in 1946 after I got out of the Marine Corps. I was doing courier service. You go into Manaus and you'd fly in these Catalina flying boats that were used to patrol the coast for submarines. A gull-wing twin-engine plane, fly about 100 feet off the Amazon and then up the Madeira. You go 1,700 miles up to Puerto Velo, Old Port, 1,700 miles from the mouth. And you see nothing but rainforest, gorgeous, verdant rainforest. And now you go through there and there are big swaths caught here. I was in Vietnam last August because 40 years ago in August I'd gone over because the United States was, we knew we were beaten, but it was 1973, 40 years ago last year. It was last year, so it's 12. That was the year that we had decided to bomb the dikes in the north because they were essential to control water level, to grow the rice, to feed the troops fighting for the country in the south. All the men were down there. In the south, everybody left the country and was in the city because you were safe in the city. But in the north, everybody's out of the city because we'd bombed the daylights out of the city, and they were out in the country hiding under the bush. The reason that Vietnam could defeat us where Iraq was destroyed is that there was no place to hide in Iraq, you know, it's just desert. They put 250,000 men out there north of Kuwait in the desert, and they're just sitting ducks. Our planes, they couldn't even hit them, I mean, and they were wiped out. 2/3 of those people were killed or injured. Pretty dumb to put them down there, but how else you prevent our armored divisions from rolling up to your cities? And that's what they decided to do. But in Vietnam, they were in the bush. But I went back in as a guest of the government of Vietnam and for the January 23rd, 40th anniversary of the Paris Peace Accords, in which the United States, people don't realize that, Mrs. Ben was Madam Ben, I should say, was the main figure for Vietnam in the 40th anniversary. And she led their peace delegation, a beautiful Vietnamese woman who had spent 3 years in prison, tortured in the South, and then escaped to the North. She was from the South, and then gotten through some schooling and gone over to Paris to be the chief negotiator for the Paris Peace Accords, in which we agreed on January 23rd to get our troops out, and we did. You remember them scrambling to get down to a helicopter from the roof of the embassy in what's now called Ho Chi Minh City, then called Saigon. And one thing that does give you hope is outside of the Agent Orange areas, which I'll get to in a minute, the people are happy. And they've got what they need. They've got plenty of food, and they're all in school, and there's excitement in their schools, and they stand on their chairs, and when the teacher asks a question, everybody's up with their hand wanting to be the one to answer it. And in the streets, you see there's plenty of food, and there may be 3 or 4 kids with their parents on a single 3-wheel motorcycle. It's a little overcrowded, but they're happy and they hang on, they don't fall off. But there's the plague of Agent Orange, in which we tried to destroy the umbrella that, and it covers a huge portion of Vietnam today, after all these years, 40 years after the ceasefire, and it's waste. And it's a powerful symbol of what we're doing to the environment. You look at the rainforest in Brazil, and it's more than, when you lose the rainforest in Brazil, you lose a lot more than just the rainforest in Brazil. You have climate change all over the place, you know, and you start getting hurricanes and stuff that you never had before. And look at what happens here now. I mean, look at the ice caps in Antarctica and the Arctic, and the beautiful polar bears just hanging on to stay alive. You know, you're out on the last iceberg, and you don't fare well on dry land, and you don't fare at all in hot weather, and it's as if nobody cares. And then you see the tornadoes. I come from Texas, and I remember one time sitting up in the Adolphus Tower. We looked out west, and we saw 7 tornadoes, but they were little things, you know. I mean, they might knock a barn down or something, but if they hit it, but they're like little whirlwinds. And now these big things come along, they take out a town of 10,000 people. They come right down the main street and just blast everything, and there are more of them, and there are more coming. And we are destroying Mother Earth, and we don't really know if it's reversible. We haven't even thought about, hey, it's what we're doing. Can we save Mother Earth? What about the children of the future? It's not enough that we let millions die of hunger and starvation and sickness every year that could have been saved easily. I mean, if we had been more for the well-being of children on Earth than power over others through militarism, there wouldn't have been hungry children, there wouldn't have been malnutrition, and we could have wiped out epidemics that take the lives of children and elderly and others. But we were more interested in power and control and concentration of wealth to ourselves. I've never understood. One time I was a young kid, lawyer, so I wasn't too young. There was a guy who was a West Point graduate. He was a lawyer, old lawyer, but he'd dropped out, but he'd take little cases, and he'd walk down the courthouse with no briefcase, but his papers in his pocket. He stopped me. I was walking down. I loved the guy, and he said, Ramsey, do you think it's possible for an honest man to be a millionaire? And I thought, probably not. The question hadn't occurred to me before that. But there's one thing, you know, is you didn't care that much for children or for elderly sick. What are you going to do with all that money, you know? You can't take it with you. And yet, $1 million is peanuts. Now, you got people with billions. And a lot of young people have learned that there's 1% that's so lust for wealth that a dying child doesn't affect them at all, much less millions. How many starve to death, children under 5 in Africa every year? That's not necessary, you know. It shouldn't happen. And if we really put our minds to it, it doesn't take much mind. What it takes is heart, you know. If we can love at a distance, you have to also respect the possibility that there's intelligence in other people and people you hate. One time I was having a talk with Saddam Hussein, and he wanted to know about President Johnson. And so I said, well, he was a school teacher. He started out, he went to, first place he had was in what we call the Valley in Texas, which is down the Rio Grande Valley, where Brownsville is the southernmost town down there. But there are just a lot of Mexican-American and Mexican kids there. And he came from the hill country, Fredericksburg a bunch of Germans, and they all had high leather shoes, and everybody had shoes. And the first day down there, the children came in, they didn't have shoes. And so help me, I have seen him cry twice in the Oval Office where the president hangs out. When all of a sudden he's, Vietnam and all this is going on, and it comes back to him that those little Mexican children, Mexican-American probably, most of them, but some of them just come across the river because you couldn't get an education or go to school on the other side, and it's easy to get across. And he cried, a grown man crying, because the kids didn't have shoes. But he'd go over at night, late night, every morning, 3 a.m., something like that, whenever the results of the day before were coming in. And he's interested in two things, the body count. And the body count was how many Vietnamese, all of the reports that would come in daily from all the military action that was going on, most of them were estimates, and probably most of them were inflated because you were a better commander if you could kill more bodies. But if the body count was high, and it was accompanied by a low loss of our planes. You'd want to know how many planes did we lose, how many Vietnamese did we kill. And if the body count was low, we didn't kill many, and the plane loss was high, he was in a mean mood all day. He didn't want to ask for more money for some project you had or some authorization or something. Just stay behind your desk and keep your head low. But if the body count was high, in other words, we killed a lot of folks, and if the plane loss was low, then you go rushing over and say, hey, I need a couple of million for this proposition, for this organized crime expedition or something like that. And I was telling Saddam Hussein this story, and he thought for a while, and he said, by the way, he had 3 translators. Most big shots from other countries will have one translator, and they're not really too interested in the translation. What they're interested in is telling the other person what they want him to know. And if they get half of what he says, that's okay. And they say, oh, we'll think about it. But Saddam Hussein used 3 translators, and with me, he always used the preeminent Shakespearean scholar. One time I made a bad mistake. We were talking, and it was a day that we were trying to nudge, our government was trying to nudge Arafat out of a peace conference. And Saddam Hussein had read in the paper, or wherever he read his information from, it said Arafat excluded from peace conference. He turned to me, and he knew I'd represented the PLO for not 30 years altogether. I don't know how many it was at that time, maybe 20. He said, what do you make of that? Arafat's not coming to the peace conference. How can you have a peace conference without him? I said, well, I guess they don't really want peace, because you can't have a peace, you can't have an agreement with the Palestinians without having the head of the government there who has the support of the people. But what he said about the children and the adults, and what he said about the soldiers of ours, primarily pilots and frontline infantry, getting killed, and the number of planes we lost, and the number of bodies counted. Saddam Hussein said, in our culture we have a saying that a prophet is a person who can love at a distance. I mean, anybody's going to love a little, if there's a little curly-headed kid right here, anybody, except some brute. You think, well, that's the cutest little kid I ever saw, and you pat him on the head and want to kiss him and hug him or her. But at a distance, that's not in your territory, you don't worry about it. But a prophet can love at a distance. You have to love at a distance to have peace, because those you don't know are at a distance. Those that you're going to have war with are at a distance. If you can't love at a distance, you're going to have... I thought there was some wisdom in that statement, but he's so thoroughly demonized that we're ready to go out and smash any Iraqi person to the ground because we think they're evil and we're good. And it ain't necessarily so. There's a guy in the Revolutionary War in the United States who had the audacity to utter that human nature is the same on both sides of the Atlantic. And the Indians had to save him because the white folks or the colonists, they wouldn't tolerate him anymore to dare to say that human nature here was the same as the human nature in England, which is trying to take our land from us or put us under their thumb. And all of it's destroying Mother Earth. And we're not effective in changing things or altering things, and the power's in the Word. And the Word's transmitted primarily now where people aren't reading heavily by television. It's the most persuasive, particularly for lazy people. And we need to reach out block by block and town by town and city by city and spread the word. The power is in the people. That is a truism. The question is whether the people have the vision and the courage and the compassion to seize that power and use it to save the children. And that's why I'm happy to talk to you folks tonight, because you can get the word out.
Hi. You're kind of a hero to me because I was an anti-war activist in the 60s and 70s, and I was very much against the war in Vietnam. I was wondering if you put your lawyer hat on and answer some questions that have been confusing to me. In the United States Code, in Title 18, Chapter 1, Section 4, regarding misprision of felony. Now, if you know of something that has happened, some terrible thing, a crime, and you're mandated to notify a judge, how do you go about doing this? Do you file an affidavit, or what do you do? Do you file a legal case? That kind of thing. And, what kind of procedure is in the United States if some terrible criminal thing has happened and a felony has been committed? How do you go about doing it?
It depends on the circumstances in part. If you see a robbery or a rape or a murder or something in action, you call the police.
Yeah, that's on the local level.
You don't wait till you can get downtown to see a judge or somebody.
Right.
And judges are not the proper person to go to, because except as a last resort to make the government do its duty, to make the executive branch do its duty.
Right.
Because it's the executive branch that's supposed to do these things. The judges are just deciders. But if the executive branch isn't doing its duty, then you can go to the judge to enforce the law against the executive branch to make them do their duty. But you have to have the gumption, and if it's a big deal, you need to organize and not just be a single voice and demand that if it's ongoing action, if it's a common crime and you see it, you have a high duty to report it to the police.
Well, if it's not a common crime, what if it's an act of treason and politicians don't want to do anything? What do you do about it?
Well, if it's politicians, the probability is that the crimes that are most important are corruption.
Yeah.
I mean, they don't choke people or commit treason overseas or something like that. Corruption infects, and it has more than effect than just them aggregating money. It destroys whole programs and government functions. And you have to work up the facts a little bit, because corruption is not usually a single transaction. It's a continuum of transactions. And you have to, it's very important for the public to be alert to corruption and to, and there are people that are located in positions where they will see it more normally. If you're a secretary in an office and you're going to see it, you've got to decide now, I lose my job, but what's more important, your job or continuing corruption?
And how do you file against?
Well, if it's city, you file it with the city attorney. If it's state, you file it with the state offices. If it's federal, you file it with the U.S. attorneys in the office, or you can file it with the investigative agencies. But
Yeah, that's the thing about investigative agencies. Back in 1939, the Federal Security Agency was created, and
the what agency?
the Federal Security Agency was created, and that was a cabinet-level position. And it included all sorts of agencies under it, including the Social Security Department, Vital Statistics, Bureau of the Census, Public Health Service, Office of Education. All these departments were under one. But then in 42 through 1944, the War Research Service was also included. And then back in 1946, some of the functions were transferred to the National Intelligence Agency. And my question is, when they create new agencies, when a succeeding agency inherits the function of a previous agency, the information that the previous agency collects, do they get the rights to that information too?
Well, let me say first that the definition of the agencies is complex, and you simplify them with words that don't necessarily fit the actual agencies. But if there's a transfer of responsibility from one agency to another, or a shift, take immigration and naturalization and all the activities that they have that involve criminal conduct, among other things. They're taken out of the Department of Justice, they're put in Homeland Security. The Homeland Security has the duty to enforce, and if it involves prosecution, to see that there's prosecution for all the prior violations that are not barred by statutes of limitations. On things like murder, there is no statute of limitation, but on most crimes, if they're not discovered and prosecuted within a certain number of years, it depends on how serious the crime is, a couple of years for minor crimes and 10 years maybe for more serious crimes like a major bribery or major corruption with public funds. But you get them to the agency that has the responsibility for that prosecution. It'll usually be the United States Attorney's Office, because
the question is, because you know that the CIA has replaced all of those other agencies, do they get to inherit all of this information that these previous agencies have collected?
well, theoretically, the CIA has no jurisdiction over domestic crime,
Oh,
none whatsoever.
I didn't know.
They're international. They're there to protect us from foreign. And the FBI, there are a dozen, but the FBI and even an organization like Food and Drug has its own. It's not that other investigative agencies' statutes won't. Agencies enforce statutes.
Right.
And if say the Department of Agriculture there are a lot of crimes you can commit against agriculture departments and duties. If they're not enforcing it, it may be under the jurisdiction of the FBI as well, and they can come in. Corruption generally within the government would come under the FBI, but we've got enforcement agencies at several levels, including just in guns, you've got firearms and other agencies than the FBI that have jurisdiction.
The FBI, would they oversee the activities of the CIA?
No, they barely talk to each other,
That's what I thought.
Robert, we're letting some other people ask questions.
which is a problem.
Yeah.
Harold, do you want to do the pointing, or you want me to?
No, I just said somebody let some
Yeah.
other people, you call them.
Huh? Well, I'll lob way back over there first.
Try and speak up loud if you can, people, for the cameras.
Yeah, I don't hear too well for one thing.
No, number one, I want to thank you so much for coming to our home to speak. And
I want to thank you all for inviting me, but go ahead now.
I have a question, and I didn't know which one to start with first. But I thought perhaps the securitization of mortgage loans and the foreclosure debacle that has come upon, and the banks that went down for the count, so to speak, Washington Mutual. And in January, the United States came to an agreement with all the loan servicers, i.e. J.P. Morgan, all the big boys that we had to bail out. And now, for instance, do the people that have the securitized loans of mortgages that the banks shuffled and repositioned, recreated, et cetera, do they have any real responsibility to pay those banks back?
Well, if I understood your question, if you don't have the money, you can't pay. So, while you might have a judgment against you and a debt for the judgment.
Now, maybe they don't have the papers that they need to show you that they even have a loan against you.
Now, you're talking about the companies or the individual owners that are dispossessed?
Show us who we're supposed to be indebted to. The servers are the middleman, the postman. Documentation that they really have down, then, ergo, do you have your debt? For instance, all the countries in Europe that are suffering economic catastrophes were the purchasers of securitized mortgage loans from America. Ireland went down. They called them the pigs. Portugal, Ireland. Oh gosh, Greece, Spain, Greece, Portugal. And they called them the pigs because they bought bonded securities from American home pairs that the banks gave. And now we're going into who allowed them to buy it. Now we're looking at an action from Washington, D.C. that is with the creditors of it. Moody's, Standards & Poor's. These are the guys that put AAA ratings on the 2008 debacle of the disaster that happened. Now, who's to blame? Now,
Obama.
no.
That's
We're-
way Obama. Adams can fire.
No, so we're talking about a massive, huge financial scandal. And we're also talking about the hedge funders who are gaining money by gambling on the bad debt as well as the good debt. And they don't care who loses, but they get the money up front and they get the money to protect them. And the taxpayers, us, have to bail the banks out? Excuse me. Where is the logic of this? Nor, where are we supposed to go with our trust in any financial institution?
Well, you can be sure that there's not much heart in any financial institution. The bottom line's all they care about. That's their code, and that's their value system. But and it's hard to generalize about that. And I'm not an economist. That's not my trade. But generally, government ought to.
The government
government ought to protect homeowners. And we've had a lot of legislation going back to the 30s protecting homeowners. Now they may, but at the same time we've seen recently, I remember driving through some areas in Southern California in the last 5 years where hundreds of houses are just sitting there empty because the person who bought it felt they could make it and they lost their job or whatever happened. And the houses anyway, there are hundreds of houses in these areas, and a substantial percentage of them, maybe a third, and some of them are empty. Empty houses is a mistake. Houses are built for people to live in.
Excuse me, sir. There was a documentary on television about China building whole cities, and they're empty. There's no people there. These are investors who are building up real estate establishments, and there's nothing to do with it. There's nobody that can purchase it. There's nobody that can buy it. There's nobody who can afford it.
Yeah.
It's dismal.
I think generalizations are dangerous because there's so many variables, but often it's a developer that wants to get big rich, and he thinks the market's going to be good. So I'm going out there. Right after the war, I represented a guy who, terrific guy. He was a Mormon, and he'd done 4 years of service abroad in Nicaragua and saw the poverty of the people there. Nobody had a home. But he came back after the war, and it was a good time to build. And he built about 15,000 homes for GIs, and their GI loan policies after the war, both Texas and federal, for housing for GIs was very good. And about 7,500 in Dallas. Then he wanted to go down to Nicaragua and build them, and Somoza wouldn't let him. Now the government and the Times made those housing projects feasible and viable, and they worked. The housing 15, 20 years later was not as good. We started building better houses and bigger houses for people by that time. But you go down to Nicaragua, and he spent a lot of time, a lot of money. It shows the difference. Somoza was the president. I went down with him. I was his lawyer, spent quite a bit of time there, and unfortunately I went into the government before he finished. But he wanted all local materials to build the house, and he worked it out, everything except the fine electrical stuff. It was too sophisticated for him to build down there. It'd have to be imported. He wanted all local labor, and he could build a nice little home for Nicaraguans for about $1,500, which doesn't, with self-help labor and all the rest. And he's prepared to try to build 2,000. It's a small country at that time, about 3 million people. And Somoza had approved it until he saw what was happening. And then he shut it down, and the reason became pretty clear. If people get houses, they get uppity, you know. They get independent. You're somebody now. You can take care of your kids, and they're not going to catch pneumonia in the first rain of the fall. And so he didn't want it. Let them live without houses, and it's easier for us to control. And there's a lot of that here, but we make mistakes from greed, and that's what happened in these areas that I saw in California, where a bunch of entrepreneurs would come in, they build all these houses and get the financing, so the banks and the government insurance and all the rest would be involved, but there wasn't a demand for the houses. There wasn't a demand of people who could afford them. They built the houses a little more expensive than they could find customers for. So you've got a mistake, and you've got these houses that are too far from sufficient number of jobs that people are going to go out there and buy them. So there are the mistakes like that. But basically, we ought to try to protect people in owning homes, and we ought to try to protect homes from being empty. So there ought to be ways to. I can remember times in cities in Texas where you'd have a lot of homeless people and a lot of empty homes. And in terms of social policy, that doesn't make much sense, does it? But the developer will tend to want to build more expensive housing because you get more money with expensive housing. You have usually a bigger margin of profit on expensive housing. On housing for poor folk or working folk that are common labor, you can't have a very big margin of profit because they can't afford very much. So anyway, those are some of the dynamics. But
No,
That was one of the questions because of a subprime mortgage. They allowed people who couldn't afford to mortgage and buy a home and allowed them to do it. And that's why it went down.
They often do that when they know darn well that person's not going to be able to pay it back. Yeah, but they'll make some money, and
But I think there's so many people.
Yeah, other
What you-
questions?
that's greed too, though.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Hey, try to speak up, too.
Yes, I wonder what you thought of the Tea Party phenomenon, because there were the know-nothings at one point, and the Tea Party seemed to be like a recurrence of this. So when you talk about people getting together and wanting to do things, you have this whole other element. They feel so strongly. If you meet any of those people, they're totally convinced that what they're doing is wonderful. You know, they believe in this. So it's very hard to do things when there's people like that on that side of things. So what do you think about how does one handle that?
She's asking about the Tea Party and that they're true believers, and they are true believers. And it's sad because what they believe isn't true. So what you, the only way I know to work with it is to, and it's very hard. First, you've got to be sure you outnumber them, because if you don't, you're going to be living in a Tea Party world. And if you do, you know a lot. It's going to be hell for poor folks, because they don't. Their compassion factor is very, very low. But and to get close enough to reason with a Tea Party mentality is pretty hard, because it's they build a big wall around it, you know. But you have to try. They're human beings too, and you try to deal with them. But it seems to me that they're fading because they're too unrealistic. I mean,
You think they're fading?
their values are too remote from reality to survive. They enjoy them mightily, but they don't work because they don't fit with the real condition. But the dominant moral quality that they possess is an immoral one, and it's covetousness. They're more interested in personal wealth than they are the welfare of children. And they're more interested in protecting wealth than they are healing the sick.
And they're religious, they have.
There's no
defense.
compassion.
Yeah, it's a religious defense. They have a religion type thing behind them, so it's very hard to argue with them.
It's a material religion in a sense that they believe in acquisition, and they believe devil take the hindmost. So you go out and grab everything you can, and don't worry about the poor folks.
Yes, I would think that you'd be quite pleased with the president's speech on Thursday talking about returning the CIA back to the OSS, where they spied and where they